with a good friend, and as we are wont to do, we began talking about what the other had been reading. Myself, as someone who's a pastor and general church nerd, always tends to read around church or theology or culture. He is a business executive coach, so he often reads about topics such as leadership and coaching and that sort of thing. And sometimes he even reads beyond those boundaries. But when he shared the name of the most recent book he had been reading, I was quite surprised. The topic and the title were a bit taboo, in fact. I was immediately curious. As someone who cannot resist an intriguing title, I've already, in fact, taken home a book and read it from the church library here. I was immediately drawn by the title and went to our local library to download the audio version of the book. The book title is this: Existential Kink, Unmask Your Shadow and Embrace Your Power, a method for getting what you want by getting off on what you don't. No. Now, I must admit, I feel a little sheepish saying those words in church and even especially from the pulpit, but I figure this is Pride Month, so we say things that are unorthodox or untraditional, and I can get away with it perhaps. And if not, I'm only here for, how many more weeks. As it turns out, this is a sermon about a kind of freedom that most would not understand. Existential Kink is a self-help book by Carolyn Elliott, and she argues that our recurring negative patterns persist because at some level we are unconsciously attached to them. And by bringing these hidden desires into the light, they lose their power over us and we become free to live differently. She's seeking to build off the words of the famed psychologist Carl Jung, who was German, I guess, right? So fits well in this context. That he said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Listening to the author as she read these words, I couldn't get away from the question, what if she's right? What if we're not nearly as free as we think we are? We say we're free, but we don't live like it. And while Elliott's language is certainly provocative, I suspect most of us would recognize that same basic premise. We know what it's like to find ourselves stuck in these same patterns again and again and again. We swear we'll respond differently next time. We promise we'll finally let it go. We tell ourselves that we're done with that bad habit, that resentment, that way of thinking. And yet somehow we find ourselves there again and again. Alas, I found myself there this past week. Which raises, I suppose, for us a rather uncomfortable question. Are we really as free as we think ourselves to be? And if we're not, what do we do about it? We often move toward tactics of control and strategy. We make vision boards, vision statements, we practice visualization, but these can sort of function like wallpaper over a deeper rot. And until we address these underlying issues, the same black mold will just seep through, infecting our relationships, our actions, and our overall well-being. And perhaps this is where I suppose things get a little interesting, because maybe the deeper issue is not that we need to get a better hold of ourselves, develop better strategies for when we lose our temper, or even become more disciplined versions of ourselves. Again, none of these are bad per se. but it's sort of like wallpapering over the black mold. It's not solving the it's not solving the rot at the core of the problem. And the deeper question is this: why do we keep returning to the things that hurt us? Why do we keep repeating those same patterns? Why do we keep finding ourselves stuck again and again in those same places? In short, why do we say we are free yet live as anything but free? I'm only a few chapters into this book, and immediately after listening to the introduction, I texted my friend and said, "This sounds very Pauline." Meaning, this sounds very similar to the questions that the Apostle Paul is wrestling with in the book of Romans. In his own way, I think Paul is asking a very similar set of questions. Why do humans keep returning to the very things that diminish them? Why do we say we're free but keep living as though we're under the power of something else? The details, of course, are different. We turn to vision boards, affirmations, strategies for self-improvement. Not again that these are inherently bad per se, but Paul's audience did something similar too, except their move was to turn to strict adherence to religious rules and practices. The challenge, of course, is that underneath both practices, both moves, is the same instinct. That if I can just get myself under control, then I will finally be free. And that's the very instinct that Paul here is trying to challenge. So Paul says something perhaps equally unorthodox and surprising to his hearers. Don't you know that you're dead? He says. Don't you realize that the old person you used to be is buried and the corpse of your old self is dead and gone? I mean, he doesn't quite say it like that. He says this. This is what we know, that the person we used to be was crucified with him in order to get rid of the corpse that had been controlled by sin. That way we wouldn't be slaves to sin anymore, because the person who has died has been freed from sin's power. Remember the question we've been wrestling with. Why do we keep returning to the things? Why do we keep returning to the things that hurt us? Paul's answer is not what we might immediately expect. He doesn't offer a better strategy. He doesn't offer a more disciplined approach. He doesn't tell us to try harder, or to go back to my children's sermon, to pull harder. Instead, he proclaims something else, something that God has already done, that the old self is dead, that the old self has been crucified with Christ, and that the good news is that in death we are freed from that which once had control or dominion over us. A few verses earlier, Paul writes that if we are united together in death like Jesus, we will also be united together in resurrection with Jesus. In other words, Paul isn't simply talking about self-improvement. He's talking about death and resurrection. He's talking about God doing something so profound that the person we were once no longer has the final word. We tend to think we're free from our past selves, our old lives, our old habits. Or perhaps more accurately, we think we can control them. We think we can manage them, contain them, keep them in check. Yet for all of our assumptions of freedom and control, we are often more bound to these old ways than we would care to admit. And Paul's entire argument is that the old self is dead and buried, and sin no longer has dominion over us. Sin no longer has control over us. Death no longer has dominion. And the question I invite you to consider this morning is whether we trust that promise to be true. In his book, The Church in an Age of Secular Mysticism, theologian Andrew Root writes that faith is about reception, not right actions or beliefs. This is quite a contrast to our modern understanding of faith. And today, in some Christian contexts, we understand faith as right beliefs, mentally assenting to the right sort of beliefs, with the assurance that if we just think the right thing or believe the right thing, then we will be okay. In other contexts, Christian contexts, faith is understood purely as right actions, that if we just do the right thing, then we'll be the right way. Again, none of these are bad per se, but they're both moves of control. And they can become assumptions that if we can simply get a hold of ourselves, if we can simply believe the right thing or simply behave the right way, then we can steer ourselves in the right direction. What Paul is saying, what the good news of Jesus is saying, I believe, is something quite different entirely. It's saying, trust the promise. Trust that this has already happened. Trust that the old self is gone and the new self is come. And to be sure, this is quite contrarian to our modern ears. Shaped as we are for command and control, our move in most places is just to try harder. To try harder. And the good news of Jesus is essentially try less. I mean, again, the finger traps. Try less. Don't produce, receive. So that it becomes not about self-mastery, but instead death with Christ. It's not about more effort, it's about God's action. It's not about fixing ourselves, but rather trusting the promise. And it's not about I will change, but rather that Christ is already changing me. And that's good news. The way Paul describes is one of reception. And it's only in a life of reception can the unknown be made known, and ourselves be made attentive to the dramatic truth of God's transformative love and grace. So then, in a way, it's not about self-control, but rather about accepting our own mortality. I see this quite often in my work as a hospital chaplain. Not too infrequently, I encounter people who have been hospitalized for what they assume is simply one too many drinks. They often say the same thing. This is my wake-up call. I'm going to get my life together. I'm going to get this thing under control. Rarely, of course, do I get to see the fruit of their actions. Except one time I did. And it was not pretty. It was a middle-aged man, not too much older than me, who had been hospitalized and was in quite bad shape. He was unconscious and had the telltale signs of a person whose liver had quite literally taken too much. Yellow and jaundiced, he lay there unconscious in the bed. And as I sat there and talked with his family and his loved ones and prayed with them and encouraged them, something about his story rang familiar. Sure enough, looking back in his chart when I was going back to track my meeting with this family and patient, I scrolled down a little bit in the chart notes, and I noticed that I had actually seen this same man some months prior. I remember hearing many of the same things from him. This is a wake-up call. I'm going to get my life together. I'm going to get this thing under control. Quite clearly, he had not. What he had thought he had control over had in fact turned out to be his slave master. And why, as unorthodox and pre-modern as those words sound to us today about slavery and bondage, I think in many ways they still ring true. The man had been unable to admit that alcohol was his slave master and that he was in bondage to it. He thought he was free, but he was anything but free. And this is why I find the path of Alcoholics Anonymous so intriguing. Each and every time they meet together, they say, willingly they say this, I'm an alcoholic. I am defeated. I'm a slave to this. Perhaps not so much in those certain terms. See, us modern people today, we tend to think that if we're a slave to something, we're not free. Paul says quite the opposite. That when we finally stop pretending that we are in control, when we finally acknowledge our own bondage, we become open to a different kind of freedom. Not by our own power or efforts or trying harder, but by the power of the one who already conquered death, Jesus. And that brings me to a second story. The first man sought freedom through control. The second man found freedom through trust. A few days ago, I think it was driving perhaps to and from church here, I was listening to an evangelical podcast about a man sharing his story about sex addiction. And he had tried it all. More rules, more control, more attempts at behavior modification. None of it worked. And none of it worked because none of it got to the heart of the matter, the deeper rot inside of him that was a deep woundedness and brokenness that he could neither fix or control on his own. One day his wife came home and asked him straight out, "Is this you?" Directly confronted with the reality, he did the unthinkable. He didn't try to fix things. He didn't try to manage. He didn't try to control things. He simply surrendered. "Yes," he said. And in surrendering and admitting that he could not fix things on his own, he joined a recovery group where he opened himself up to the radical and transformative grace of God. He made himself receptive to this truth. And when he finally acknowledged his own death and failure, newness could be born within him. Whereas in the past he sought freedom through control and trying harder, instead he found freedom through trust. Friends, this is the good news of the gospel. This is it right here. Not that we finally can get our lives under control, but that in Jesus Christ, as we've already sang this morning, our chains are broken and we've been set free. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Can you hear me? Okay. I am in some locations called Reverend John Case. Part of the reason for wearing this shirt is to commemorate almost 2 years ago when MCC closed here in Fort Collins. I was the pastor at that point in time. But as Father's Day, I love the fact that what they might sometimes call the original Paul, the loving Paul, was the author of the scripture that you used today. Now with me and our son, I recognized in him a growing depression. And one night, it was too big to ignore. And so I said, we've got to talk. Typical? His answer was, I'm too busy today. I said, I understand. You see, he was working at an interior design degree up in CSU. He also had a full-time job and was actually a person who had the perception that he could tell colors and tones of paint better than the machines could. And so I wound up telling him, if we don't talk now, you're either going to hurt yourself or hurt somebody else trying to hurt yourself. You see, I had learned to watch for the warning signs of suicide ideation. So he was at that point. I said, okay, let's talk. Then the famous quote that I use, he says, okay, as he sat down at the top of the stairs in our two-story and said, go get Mom, because I'm only going to say this once. And he began, which is normal, what I've learned, I think I might be gay. To age myself, the first thought that came into my mind was an old phrase called circle the wagons. Because I knew that there was danger in that being. And as we went through the process, it's about 1.5 years, 2 years after that, he dressed in a dress during coming out day at CSU. He was so good, he was on the front page of the Collegiate. What that did was let his two brothers know. His twin brother was okay. His older brother, not so much. You see, I had been raised in a very, very conservative church. I had actually been a minister there at that particular point in time, about 33 years. And so our son was given the opportunity to either go back in the closet or leave the church. He says, I want to fight, Dad. And I said, I know, but let Dad fight this one. He said, you have too much tied into getting your degree, to being you. You don't have the emotional or the physical strength to do it all. He said, okay. I said, go ahead and write your letter of resignation, and I'll fight it as long as they let me. 2 years later, two leaders of that church asked to spend the night at our place. So they had dinner, they had breakfast, then they told my wife she needed to leave the house. And then they sat across the kitchen table from me and told me that I had been silenced as a minister, I could no longer serve, and that if I was a good boy and continued with what they wanted, I might get my ministry back. Then they asked about my membership. At that particular point in time, and trying to make sense out of being gay and support, my wife and I had joined PFLAG. In fact, it was at a point where I had been invited to join the board, but I was kind of pushing back. I said, okay, if I continue my work with PFLAG, would I be considered a member in good standing? Now there they have a closed communion. You're not in good standing, you don't get communion. And they say, no, PFLAG's an enemy to the church. So, make a long story short, 2 weeks later, I was on the board of PFLAG Fort Collins. 2 months later, I was on the board of Lambda Community Center. What I learned through that was a love I don't think I'd ever experienced before. Because I was working, I was going through that, I was trying to learn more and more, and it was season of Pride. Not during Pride, we were just getting started on planning. And so I happened to leave work, get up to Fort Collins, and work for me at that point in time was the IBM location in Boulder. And so I got there a little early, and I was exhausted. So they just threw me a pillow and said, lean over into the corner. It'll be a while, and we'll wake you up. Well, when I did wake up, instead of a room that had about 3 people in it, there was probably 40 people there. And they were just getting started talking about Pride. What I noticed right off the bat was I had a feeling of perfect safety and peace. In a room full of gays, lesbians, and transgender people. That evening, I fell in love with the group. That was perfect safety in a very, very closed facility. And first thing that I have started to try to do is how do we expand out of small areas? To me, as a father, that's what you do. You try to make it easier, not only for your kids, but the kids that look at you as a father figure. Needless to say, Lambda Community Center is no more. I was selected as one of 3 that we actually worked to try to go ahead and start a new organization. Instead of a new organization, we wound up working in Denver. What used to be the GLBT Center of Denver became the GLBT Center of Colorado, and they opened a chapter up here. It only lasted about 2.5 years. Won't get into the reasons why, but it happened. Then, as luck would have it, I was making a shift, saying, okay, how can I not only work in the physical and the nonprofit area, but also start addressing the spiritual area as well? Because one thing I haven't mentioned is as I left the church, I still held on to this idea that God and that church were tied together. I wound up going to Isla School of Theology. Got my master's in divinity. What I learned through my internship, and it was an interesting one. Up here, I was going with the ministry of the Center for Spiritual Living. Down in Colorado Springs, I was interning with MCC. As the old pastor at MCC in Fort Collins said, you're going to come out very, very progressive. One of the things I had learned, even before the kids came along, was every 2 years, you really need to sit down and say, okay, what have I learned? First step. Second step, how do I apply it to my current belief system? That's where you grow. That's where you get that freedom. And so, from my point of view, I know I'm running short on time. I will just end with this. When does that fight finish? It doesn't finish for everyone at the same time. But from my perspective, when you no longer have new experiences, no longer learn, and so you can't take that learning and apply it to you, that's when your end of the fight finishes. But I think it is part of God's plan. We always have something to learn because we were created to be more than we realize. Thank you.
Let's join together in our prayer of divine affirmation, declaring that I am a vibrant and unique expression of the divine presence of the universe. Acknowledging my potential, I allow my inner wisdom to guide. I am an ever-evolving spiritual being. There is a place for me at God's table. As an expression of the divine, I am inherently good. Loving Creator of infinite colors, we thank you for the beautiful, sacred diversity of our being. You have made us exactly as we are, and in you we are fearfully, wonderfully, and perfectly made. Remove our shame, doubt, and fear from our hearts. Grant us the courage to live authentically, the strength to embrace our truth, and the grace to love others as deeply as we are loved. May we always know that we are your beloved children. Amen.